Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 255 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the new book Cosmic Powers, the saga anthology of faraway galaxies, edited by our producer John Joseph Adams. And I'm joined by three guests. So first up, of course, we've got John Joseph Adams. He's the editor of Lightspeed and Nightmare magazines, and he also oversees John Joseph Adams Books, an imprint of Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. He's the series editor of The Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, and he's also edited many other anthologies, including the recent books Loosed Upon the World and What the Bleep Is That? So John, welcome back.
Always good to be here.
Then next up, we've got Tobias Buckell, making his 9th appearance on the show. He's the author of the Xenowealth series of space adventure novels, the eco-thrillers Arctic Rising and Hurricane Fever, and the Halo novels The Cole Protocol and Envoy. His short story, Zen and the Art of Starship Maintenance, appears in Cosmic Powers. So Toby, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me again.
And also joining us today is Becky Chambers. She's the author of the novels The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet and A Closed and Common Orbit, and her articles have appeared on Tor.com and PornoKitsch.com. Her short story, The Deckhands, The Nova Blade, and The Thrice-Sung Texts, appears in Cosmic Powers. So, Becky, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Okay, and so, Becky, since you're joining us for the first time, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit? So I think you started out in the writing world as a video game reviewer, is that right?
My public-facing writing, yes. It was half that and half technical writing that nobody got to see. So, yeah, in the grand tradition of freelance writers everywhere, it was a hodgepodge of things. But yeah, video games were the thing most people knew me from. Oh, most people being the small handful of people reading my stuff back then.
So how did you get into video game reviewing?
I've been gaming all my life and just started pitching. It was just like, hey, I do this a lot. I think I write okay. And just kept bothering editors until somebody let me publish something.
So where did your first video game review appear?
I was the weekly video game columnist at the Mary Sue between 2011 and 2014. So I was primarily writing there. I had a few other pieces here and there. Nowadays, I'm not doing any games journalism. It's gone back to being a hobby, which is kind of nice.
I mean, did you have any video game reviews that you were particularly proud of that you wrote?
Oh gosh. I mean, I stopped doing it 3 years ago, so let me dredge the archives here. I did more sort of impressions. I mean, I did some straight up reviews, but a lot of my stuff was sort of impressions of gameplay and just the sort of really personal connection to how games make you feel. I think probably my favorite one I did was an article about teaching my mom to play Portal 2 and sort of just picking apart the things I took for granted in games, the learning curve I'd kind of forgotten about, and just the joy of watching her figure it out and understand why I love this hobby so much.
That's really funny. So, I mean, had you been writing fiction that whole time, or kind of when did you start writing fiction?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've been writing fiction forever, but I hadn't been successful in getting anything published up to that point. Perhaps not the best thing to say given the context of this podcast, but short stories are something I have a lot of trouble with. I don't think they don't come as I don't want to say easily, but as naturally to me as writing long form. So, and there's this sort of, this thing, right, where, before you write a book, you're supposed to write short stories. And so I spent a lot of years banging my head against writing short stories and not having any luck there until finally I was just like, maybe I'm just supposed to write books. Maybe I should start there and do it backwards. So sure enough, I mean, I got my novel out before I got any short stories published. So my first book was the first time I'd had any fiction out there.
And you had a Kickstarter, right, to get that written?
Yeah, that's right. I used a Kickstarter to fund my remaining months of writing time. I was about 2/3 of the way through the manuscript, and my freelance work dried up, and so it was a sort of do or die, you know, Hail Mary trying to get that book done. And I told myself at the time, if this isn't successful, it's a sign you need to go get a real job. And to my eternal surprise, it was a success. So yeah, that was the thing that kind of got the ball rolling.
And those were people who had read your video game pieces, right? Because you had no fiction out, right?
Right. And I mean, I think the majority of people there were strangers. There was a few friends and family in there too, but most of the people were folks, I am assuming, who knew me from my games writing. But beyond that, it just, I to this day, I'm just like, wow, who were these people? Because I'm eternally grateful. But I'm assuming that's where most of them were from, yes.
And then the book got picked up by a traditional publisher. Is that right?
Yeah. So I originally self-published, and then some months after the fact, I was contacted by my now publisher, Hodder and Stoughton, asking me if I was interested in signing on with them, and I was, and which brings us to now. So yeah, it's been kind of a crazy ride the last few years.
And John was just mentioning before we started recording here that you've been nominated for different awards and things. It's all really cool.
Yeah, thank you. My current book, my most recent book, Closed in Common Orbit, is currently up for the Hugo and the Arthur C. Clarke. So that's wow, that's a sentence that just came out of my mouth. So I'm still pinching myself over that one.
Well, right, but you know that you've really made it when you get included in a John Joseph Adams anthology, right? I mean, yeah.
Honestly, I was so excited to get that email. I was like, oh man, yes. It was it made me overcome my fear of short stories, honestly. I didn't say that to John when I got the email. I was just very professional, like, yes, of course I'd like to contribute. And inwardly I was going, oh my God, can I write a short story? Apparently I can. So
well, no, you definitely can, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But so, John, why don't you tell us just about this anthology, Cosmic Powers? Just how did it come about?
Well, it basically came about, it was directly inspired by my love of, like, the Marvel cosmic universe, so, like, Silver Surfer and the Infinity Gauntlet and Guardians of the Galaxy, and we talked about that a little bit before on the show, but, I mean, most directly, I guess it was inspired by the Guardians of the Galaxy movie that came out, the first one that came out, it was a surprise hit, and I just thought it was a lot of fun, and actually, I had somehow missed Guardians of the Galaxy in comics. Like, I think it was at a period when there was no new comics in that series coming out. But the characters, of course, were around. Like, I was familiar with Gamora and stuff like that. But anyway, with the success of the movie, I sort of went and delved back into some of these comics that I really loved, like Silver Surfer and Infinity Gauntlet and all that, and it just got me thinking about that kind of science fiction that's like, not really, it's kind of science fiction because it kind of feels like it because it takes place out in space and with planets and stuff and traveling between stars and all that, but it's just like it pushes everything past the limits of believability where it's like basically fantasy, that kind of stuff really kind of laid the groundwork for me as a reader, and so most of the science fiction that I've read isn't along those lines, but I always loved that when I encountered it in comics, and I wanted to see if we could try to replicate that sort of feeling in prose. So that's what inspired the anthology.
Well, right. So talk a little bit about the process of putting it together, because it's published by Saga, where our good friend Joe Monti is, right? Did you just email Joe and say, I got this idea for an anthology, or?
I mean, that's kind of how it works. I mean, Joe Monti used to be my agent, so obviously we have a pretty good relationship, and we parted amicably and everything. He retired from agenting to become an editor at Saga, so it was all good. But this was actually a bit of an unusual situation because normally, I come up with an idea for an anthology and then I pitch it to a publisher, and I have to recruit a bunch of authors, and then the publisher make a decision whether or not they want to do it. This one actually, I sold a 2-book deal to Saga, So the first one was the What the Bleep Is That anthology that I did, that we talked about before. And so, but then the second book was just unspecified at the time of the sale. And then, how that would work is that, okay, so they agreed to do the 2-book deal. And then when I came up with the idea for Cosmic Powers, I just did a sort of a more informal pitch. And then, Joe basically had to say yes or no. And so it was one of the easier books I managed to sell because I didn't have to put together the whole full proposal and do a bunch of recruiting ahead of the time. I could just pitch it to Joe and, get him to say, yes or no, because he obviously trusts my ability as an anthologist. He knows I'm going to deliver a bunch of good authors in the book, and the stories themselves will be good, of course. So yeah, it was a little bit smoother than some of my projects. Like, I've had a couple, I had like this one, proposal recently that has like a bunch of good authors associated with it. And I think it's a good, fun concept, but, just like nobody wants it. So that's how it goes sometimes. So it's nice when you get one like this, where it's like kind of a slam dunk.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so Toby, let's get you in here. So talk about getting this, finding out about this anthology from John. Kind of what was his pitch and how did you react to it?
I love the idea. The idea of just sort of larger than life science fiction epic stuff, related back to the idea of trying to capture some of that essence of Guardians of the Galaxy and bring it into fiction, because that's some of my favorite fiction, that sort of Star Wars epic space opera stuff. I love it. So when John came to me with the idea for the anthology, there's a really interesting backstory to the story, which was that I'd come up with a title for a short story that I wanted to write for, I think 3 or 4 years maybe, which was the title of the story that's in the anthology, Zen and the Art of Starship Maintenance. And I really jumped on the opportunity to write this because the person who helped me come up with that title was actually Christy Yant, John's significant other. I was monkeying around on Twitter with her and I think John Klima, and we were coming up with just titles that we felt should exist but didn't yet. And they had thrown out a couple of just funny titles based on classic movies or famous pieces of works of literature with a science fictional twist, and everyone was having a good time and yucking it up on Twitter. And I spat out Zen and the Art of Starship Maintenance, and we sort of all got quiet for a while, and someone says, someone should write that. And I kind of grabbed that and said, I'd like to write that actually. But I really didn't have a strong idea of what to write, other than I just desperately wanted that to be a story that existed. And I was really shocked that no one else had ever taken Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and science fictionalized the title. So that was the seed that kind of sat in there. And then when John approached me, I thought, that sounds like a cosmic title. Any of the titles for any of the short story ideas I have inside of any of my files have a cosmic title. It was Zen and the Art of Starship Maintenance. So I told John, like, I have this great idea. That the problem for me was mainly that I was going through a 2-year period of some of the most intense deadlines and amount of work that I've ever gone through in my entire life. I was just slammed, and I sort of told him, like, I really desperately want to do this, but I don't know if I have the time. So John was really, really patient about working with me on this story, because it is a miracle that it even came into being, to be honest with you.
Well, yeah, because I know I invited you to be on the show a couple times, and you're just like, oh, I'm too busy, I can't even do it. So, just to give people, because I know how much you love being on this podcast. So
I love being on this podcast.
How busy you were.
I was going to say, actually, one other funny thing that I ended up with this story and this anthology based on that whole story about how it came about because of the title. I actually wrote an article for the Syphil Bulletin about writing short story title or creating short story titles, and I called it Zen and the Art of Short Story Titling. And so, given the fact that I also riffed on the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and then Toby came up with this title independently of the story, and then wrote the story, it all seems like cosmic, some sort of cosmic forces at work here made this happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I thought it would just be perfect to sell it to John because of that connection. I thought if I could pull that off, it's going to be a great bar story.
I mean, I know, I saw that the author of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance passed away recently. Were you fond of that book at all, or did you just like the title?
Here's my deep, dark secret. I've only read a chapter of the book. I just love the title. I've always loved the title. I've always meant to read it. I'm really sorry to hear he's passed. I know it had a huge impact on so many people, and it was a highly recommended book to me by many, many people. So it's just been in my consciousness forever. And I've always meant to get around to reading it. And I read just a little bit of it once when I was in high school to sort of sample whether it was my sort of cup of tea. And at the time it really wasn't, but I appreciated how much of an impact it had on people. And I loved the title so much. I thought just for that alone, it was kind of a work of art all in and of itself. And it was totally worth me buying the book and, sending royalties the artist's way. And I've seen so many other people riff off of that title that, when it came time to write, to come up with the story idea, I thought, wow, that's a real obvious one. How come no one's ever done that story?
Yeah. I was kind of curious, Toby. I know you grew up on a boat in the Caribbean, and John was mentioning these Marvel comics with like Galactus and Thanos and stuff like that. Were those comics things that you were kind of exposed to when you were growing up?
A little bit. I mean, growing up in the Caribbean, the distribution wasn't as strong as it is here in the States, but we did have access to comics in the U.S. Virgin Islands back when we used to have grocery store racks, if anyone's old enough to remember that. You used to be able to go to convenience stores and they'd have these spin racks with comics and magazines in them. And so I picked up a handful of comics over the years, but it was really hit or miss, and it was really hard to follow a series because you never knew what distribution was going to send down there. I had a few friends who had some really good comic collections that I would read, but I mainly caught up on some of the base level stuff, which is some of the core X-Men during the late 80s, early 90s, and a few other titles like that. For the most part, I didn't buy a lot of comics because I'm a really fast reader, and the comics were I think back then $1.25 or something like that. So 4 comics would take me about 15 to 20 minutes of reading time, whereas a $4 book was 5 hours of reading time. And so for me, the per hour entertainment cost benefit analysis was leaned really a lot stronger towards the books.
Yeah, I was kind of the same way, Toby, with the comics. But I mean, how about Becky? Were you ever into these kinds of comics that John was talking about?
I didn't get a good introduction to comics until I was an adult. So my love for crazy space stories is much more based in TV and film. So I tell people that I can't remember life before Star Wars, and I literally can't. my dad, this being the 80s, my dad had, bootlegged VHS tapes of the original trilogy, and I would just watch them with him over and over and over again. And this is before I could properly form sentences. I don't mean writing, I mean speaking. So to say that the idea of space opera and of space magic, it was a hugely formative thing for me. It imprinted on me before, I had the sense to not walk across the street without looking.
I guess, John, I mean, speaking of space opera, John, do you see this as this anthology as a space opera anthology, or do you see it as something at all different from just what space opera implies?
Right, yeah, I mean, it's kind of space opera, but I mean, I think it's more specific than that. I think when you say space opera in the modern understanding of that term, as opposed to the sort of classic one, which is mostly dismissive, the modern understanding of it is, tends to be more realistic than what's, portrayed in this book generally. I mean, some of the stories are probably more comfortably fit with the term space opera, but some of them are just sort of they push everything so far to the edge that it's hard to call it space opera. But on the other hand, I mean, a lot of people call Star Wars space opera, and if that is, then I mean, almost anything. You can do almost anything in a story and still still call it space opera. I mean, because it's so much unbelievable stuff happens in Star Wars that then not much that happens in this book really goes too far past that. Although there are the couple stories that have the giant giant god heads and stuff that people walk around on.
Is this? I only have an arc of this, John. But it looks like maybe there's going to be a bibliography in the back. Are there books that people might know that you would say are kind of in the same vein as this anthology?
Oh yeah, no, there's no bibliography or anything like that. But let's see. I mean, Yeah, I mean, there aren't any like books, like anthologies or novels that come to mind immediately, like that are too similar to this. I mean, my go-tos are the comics to recommend. Obviously, I mentioned the Infinity Gauntlet and Silver Surfer. I was going to say, actually, I should have mentioned earlier, when I was talking about the inspirations, it's like I actually dedicated the book to Jim Starlin, Ron Mars, and Ron Lim. And then I called them Heralds of Wonder, like as a Silver Surfer reference. But
that's great, by the way.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's funny. Like, so I did that. And I did it sort of like after the fact. Like, I didn't think about it as I was building up the book. But then at the last minute, I was like, oh, I should do a dedication. And I was like, oh, well, obviously, I should dedicate to those guys. And when I did it, I put together the page and I sent it into Saga. And then I was telling Christy about it, and I got all emotional talking about it. Like, where I didn't really think about it as being like so important to me to acknowledge these guys for the work that they had done that had inspired me in this way. But when I started telling her about it, I got all emotional. So Jim Starlin and Ron Mars are two of the writers who worked on Silver Surfer back in the 90s, which is when I was reading it mostly. And then Starlin also wrote Infinity Gauntlet. I think all of them, but at least for the most part. And then Ron Lim was like the primary artist that I loved from Silver Surfer. So I never had any interaction with Ron Lim or Jim Starlin, but I actually had been in touch with Ron Mars at one point. And so after we had the arcs and everything of the book, I sent him like a screenshot of the dedication page to let him know that it was there, and I got his address from him so I could send him a copy and everything. But then I felt like a dumbass because he's like, oh, next time you do one of these, you should let me know. And I always like to stretch my writing muscles and try a different form. It's like, oh God, I should have asked him to write a story. Why didn't I do that? I did have previous contact with him, so. I was like, oh man, I was just kicking myself after that. But yeah, I mean,
you gotta do a follow-up anthology, even more cosmic powers.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely would love to. I mean, it was so much fun putting this book together, and I'm so happy with how it turned out, and the publisher's really happy as well, and it seems like it's getting really good reviews so far. So, so I mean, I'm down for it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so Becky, so you said you get this this email from John or whatever, and you say, yeah, I can write a short story, and then you're not at all sure that you actually can, right? Kind of talk about what happened next there.
Right. So I was on deadline for A Closed and Common Orbit when I got that email, and I sat there going, oh, I don't know, like I've got this book I'm barreling through, and I don't know if I should do this at all, but just the prompt was so delicious. I couldn't say no. I was like, that just sounds so fun, and especially because, the sort of that little nuance between science fiction and science fantasy, like I write about far future and aliens and spaceships and all these things in my books, but science fantasy, I was like, oh man, I can just goof off. Like I can just get really ridiculous and it sounds so fun. But I also, being on deadline, didn't have a world of time. And part of my problem with short stories is I really love lore. Like I really love digging into world building and creating these places. And I knew, that I wouldn't be able to fit all of it into 10,000 words, which has always been my problem with short stories. And also that I didn't have time because I had to get back to my books. So I decided to play to my strengths and keep it simple, keep it personal, tell a story that fit into the broader theme, but that I don't want to say that I could get through quickly because that makes it sound like I was rushing it, which I wasn't. But just something that I felt that I could confidently do. So what I did is I took a story we've all seen 20,000 times about the unwitting chosen one, and the misfit, the lowborn kid who nobody thinks much of, and who's destined to be a hero. And I said, okay, well, what if she's really terrible at this and she doesn't go through all the arcs of making friends and actually becoming the hero by the end? What if she's reluctant the entire way through? And two, what if she's really lonely? What if, she doesn't get all the buddies that kind of character usually gets along the way? What if her story isn't it isn't the big heroic victory we expect it to be? And so I kept all of the action off screen kind of, and to just left it at her personal logs, her talking about this experience. And that was really fun because I could throw in all these details about all the crazy stuff going on in the galaxy, but at the end of the day, she just wants to come home and have a sandwich. So, so that was the direction I headed in with that.
Well, so when you say the story was personal, do you just mean it's focused very specifically on this character, or is it autobiographical or anything like that?
Oh, well, I mean, I haven't killed any like giant interdimensional monsters.
Okay, and that's
lately,
what I was curious about. So.
Okay, I mean, I'd love to say yes, but I mean, there was a little bit of, I did mean it in more the sense that it's a very introspective story about her, but there was a little bit of drawing from myself a little, just a smidge in something you guys are probably familiar with that I've been encountering, as my writing, it has gone out there. The difference between how people see you and who you are at home. The difference between Becky Chambers, who's the author, and Becky Chambers, who spends most of her time sitting in her backyard. Who you are sitting at the signing table versus who you are, when you're in your pajamas and you should be doing something more important. So I had been doing a lot of thinking along those lines as I headed into my second book. And I think some of that bled in there for sure.
So how do you think people see you when you're out in public or in your author persona?
I have no idea. I think, I don't know. I don't know how people see me, but I know I am mindful of how people see me. When I go to conventions and whatnot, I think all of us do this. You're very careful about, what you say on panels, how you present yourself, what you're going to wear that day. And all of it, none of it is dishonest, but at the same time, you are choosing which aspects of yourself to show to other people. It's not that you're putting on a facade, but it is that you're being selective about what parts of you they see. And I think that was a little bit, that's the part I have in common with that character I wrote. Monsters, not so much, unfortunately. But
well, we'll also talk about the monsters for people who haven't read the story. Just kind of what is it about?
Sure. So the broader story at large is that you have these monsters called the Crates, and they're these giant serpent-like beings that have been going around devouring cities. They're after our bioenergy, which is a nonsense thing I made up. But they chow down cities. Mostly they're after us, and the buildings are just kind of, I don't know, croutons or something. And these have happened before in the galaxy, and in times of yore, there was this hero who was given this, we'll say magical. I mean, I know we're not supposed to say magic in a science fiction setting, but that's what it is. This sword that channels her super special energy through it and becomes the super weapon that she uses to kill the Queen Crate. But they've come back, and they have to, the powers that be are trying to find her descendant, because she's the only one who can wield the sword and stop the Crates. And so it's this, I don't know, in my mind it was very classic sort of popcorn movie sort of story about, you've got the big monsters, and you've got the crazy sword, and you've got the chosen one, and all this stuff I just gobbled up as a kid.
Well, you have a lot of fun in the story with the idea of how much sense does it really make to have a sword that only the descendant of this person can wield?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely wanted to call that out, because I think if I were in that position, I would think it was a stupid thing to do, because you should, it's wildly inefficient, right? Like, if you have these things that are out to destroy the galaxy, and you have this one weapon that only one person can wield. That's really cool in a hero's journey sort of way, but you're gonna lose a lot of planets before you figure out who can pick that thing up.
And one detail I thought was really interesting is that you have these kind of priests, psychics or something, prophets who gain their powers by staring at the sun until they go blind.
Yeah, I have no idea where I came up with that, but I thought it was a neat idea. I somehow just felt like a natural choice to have there be a religion built around this idea. I think that's kind of a staple of science fantasy. I was thinking that as I was reading some of the other stories in the anthology, that religion, not faith or spirituality, but like cult or some sort of analog to the Catholic Church. This is something that comes up a lot in this kind of thing. And I think it's because you're dealing with, floating godheads and all the rest of it. So it seemed like a natural choice, to include a bit of that in there, because plus then you get prophecies and whatnot. And so I don't know, I had this idea of, if you stare at the sun for long enough, you can open your mind up to the larger secrets of the universe, which is not true. I don't am doing that. Don't test out that theory. But yeah, I liked I like my my made up religions to have a little bit of something kind of spooky.
I was always really captivated as a kid by the idea that you could get superpowers by doing something that I could actually do, like staring at the sun until I went blind, as opposed to being born on Krypton or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If only I lived next to a nuclear power plant.
If only.
I mean, John, do you have anything you want to add about Becky's story?
No. I mean, I thought it was great, obviously, but it was. If I recall correctly, it was basically ready to go when she turned it in. So I think she's underestimating her abilities to write short stories. We tinker with the title, but that was about it. But I do that all the time. I retitle like half the stories that get sent to me, so it's like that's not unusual.
But we didn't have to retitle mine.
That's true. Yours was right on.
So it was originally the twice sung text, and you're like, let's bump this up a little bit. I think we can go for thrice sung.
Yeah, I don't remember what it was called originally, but I remember that I did fixate on the thrice sung text when I came across it in the actual story, and I was like, oh, it'd be really great to get this as part of the title. And so I went with that. I think I don't remember if I suggested this exactly, but I think I did suggest this sort of triptych of phrases.
Yeah, it was. The title is exactly what you suggested.
Oh, okay.
The original, I've been actually struggling to remember the whole time because yours just stuck. But the original was The Private Logs of Eris Redstone, which was the name of the character, which is not actually in the story at all. And you were like, well, you've got these other words in here that I like better, so let's use those. But I actually did. This is an Easter egg for anybody who's read my second book. There's a part in my second book where one of the main characters is going through action figures she has from her favorite Sims, like her favorite future video games, and she mentions that one of them is Eris Redstone. So so it's which nobody would get except me. It's a title that wasn't used for a character that wasn't named, but I still kept it.
No, but I thought it was a very confidently written story. I'm surprised to hear that you were so apprehensive about it. I think you shouldn't be, because you can clearly write short stories quite well.
Well, thank you. That's very gratifying to hear.
So how about Toby? So you told us that you had the title, right? The Zen and the Art of Starship Maintenance. And then how did
Correct.
you go about building a story around that title?
Well, so that was the panicky part for me, because as we came up close to the deadline and I kept having to ask John for an extension because I was working on this other project. I was trying to finish up Halo Envoy, which just came out last week. And that was turning into way bigger of an edit and process. And it just kept eating more and more of my time. So by the time I actually sat down to write this story, I think like John had given me so many different extensions to try and get me in there that I was, I had days on the clock. I think, John, I had like a week or something before your absolute, you need to go away sort of deadline.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah. And so when I finally got that week, what I really wanted to do was just sleep for a week. You know, when I was done with the Halo Envoy edit, I was exhausted but I really wanted Zen and the Zen and the Art of Starship Maintenance to exist. So when I sat down and started working on it, I had to come up with a story worthy of the title, which is the reason I hadn't actually written it yet, because I hadn't come up with a story worthy of the title at all. And all of the ideas I'd come up with were a bit trite, and I just kept rejecting. Because I really feel with a title like that, you kind of have to deliver. And so with 7 days on the clock and being exhausted, I was just not sure what to do. And I happened to be reading a book about Grenadian history. I was born in Grenada. I'm born in Grenada. I'm Grenadian. And there is a book called A Woman's History of Grenada Up to the Revolution. And it dealt with a lot of the sort of dark history of slavery, but also with labor relations pre-revolution. The Grenadian Revolution happened in 1979 when I was born. And during that period, there was a lot of poverty and struggle on the island, you know, post-slavery all the way up to the revolution, where people were trying to get workers' rights, trying to get more money, trying to get infrastructure, and their communities developed, and international conglomerates were, you know, not giving them a lot. And all throughout the book, from the time of slavery all the way through to prior to the revolution, there was a really long history of labor rights actions that were taken by the disenfranchised. So you had people doing a lot of things that are common in other places when they fight back for labor rights. For example, like work slowages, not stoppages, because when you're in a position of being enslaved, you know, a work stoppage is something that will get you, you know, enormous lashback, literally, or death. So in the case of many of these workers, they would do things like interpret orders literally to the letter and still manage to mess up the process to slow things down, or just literally slow the work way down. And there were some later on, some walkouts and things of that nature. But it was an essential tool as I began to do some other scholarship in some of the other Caribbean history books I was reading at the time for trying to gain back some measure of control during these dark periods. And I found that something that kind of sat in the back of my head. And I happened to be reading a piece of scholarship about how Asimov came up with the 3 laws of robotics and how Campbell suggested them to him, Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell being sort of a noted, sort of just general racist.
No, John W. Campbell.
John W. Campbell. Thank you.
Joseph Campbell's the mythology guy.
The mythology guy. Sorry. There's my verbal dyslexia for you. Thank you for the correction. Campbell, the editor of Analog back in the day, was really noted for, you know, making arguments for pro-slavery and things of that nature. You know, as friends of his time supposedly said, he just likes to, like, you know, play the devil's advocate. But I find it kind of intellectually odious. And thinking of the fact that he was the one that came up with the 3 laws of robotics, and I was reading about slavery and workers' rights, I just kind of immediately kind of clicked those two things together to come up with the story, which was to come up with someone who had been a person who's now a robot, and who, as a robot, is sort of having to use some of the same tools as people who were once enslaved had to use in order to sort of navigate their situations. And that was just kind of the sort of basic seed that the story came from, which was trying to imagine what a robotic personality would do. Because, you know, I love Star Wars. I love that epic space opera thing. But one of the things that I find really interesting and that we don't really acknowledge a lot is that as much as we laugh at C-3PO and R2-D2, they're essentially slaves. You know, in the very first movie, we get that moment where they're like, you know, we don't allow any of their kind into the bar. And there's this sort of like secondary class status that the robots have just because they're robots, but ostensibly they're thinking and, judging by C-3PO's drama, feeling creatures, right? Even if they are made out of metal. And yet they are used for free labor and sold around. And Luke Skywalker is the hero of the rebellion, but he's essentially a slave owner. And so looking at that from that perspective, I just kind of wanted to take that big space opera kind of assumption about, metal beings and kind of pack them into this story and give the point of view to the robot.
Right. So in this world that you've created, there's sort of this conflict between the robots and what you call the preservationists, right?
Mm-hmm. The formists, they're interested in the original human form and being, more pure.
Right. And so we actually have a formist right here on our panel, because I know that John Joseph Adams does not believe that if he transfers his mind into a robot body, that will really be him.
Well, that's true. I mean, it's not because I believe that the human body is inherently superior or anything. I just don't believe that we would survive that transfer as the same consciousness.
Right.
Oh, and see, I'm the opposite, because I would upload myself to a computer in a hot second.
Oh, I would love it. No, don't get me wrong. If it worked, I would love it. I don't believe that it would be possible. If you tried to make that attempt, I feel like that would be creating a copy of your consciousness, and it would think it's you. And, for all intents and purposes, everyone else would think it's you. But the real you would die at some point, and then just this copy of you would live on. And that's not the same thing. Because there would be at least a split second where you simultaneously exist, and you're thus different beings that are existing in the same space-time continuum or whatever. So, yeah, that's my
Well, this is this great dilemma, right? Because the person in this story is someone who's been copied off of a human mind. So whether or not he's that original human, or in this story, he says there are many copies of himself because he's a competent worker and navigator. That means that the people who hire and basically buy his quote unquote contract don't view him basically as human. And, one of the things I found is that, I can science fictionalize and talk about race and society in many different ways, but sometimes when you talk about actual race, people come to it with so much baggage. So one of the things I was trying to do was try to look at what would be a futuristic but realistic, philosophical, profound split among what we would view as human in the future. For example, the robot himself definitely views himself as cognitive, but he has a lot of different, as a thinking being, but he has lots of different viewpoints about what a human being can then be, because he doesn't have a human form. He looks more kind of like a spider. He's adapted to working on the outside of the hull. He doesn't view the idea of having a name as important. He just has basically an IP address, which is all he cares about, hey, yeah. And so he looks very alien and very robotic and very not us. And the enemy of this piece is someone who's a formist, someone who has retained his original form. And while he uses implants and things like that to keep himself alive for long, believes that, you should be flesh and blood, basically. You should look like a human. You should have a name. And, there have been wars and memes and fights and philosophical differences about this all throughout the galaxy in the place where the story takes place. And even though the formist has lost the battle, he still has a lot of trouble to cause. The third thing that came into writing this story is this is my fourth attempt to do a rewrite, or to grab the idea of a story by Joseph Conrad called The Secret Sharer and science fictionalize it. For those of you who haven't read it, it is a story by Joseph Conrad. It's about a captain who's on a ship. He's just been made a captain. He's a very young captain, inexperienced, think Kirk in the movies. And he's at anchor somewhere in the South Pacific when someone swims onto his boat, a stowaway, and crawls aboard. And he's escaped from another ship. He's a fellow captain. Everyone has mutinied, and he needs to get away. And so the captain of this new ship keeps him on board the ship, takes care of him, and then as he sails by land, secretly basically goes really close to the reef so that the guy can jump off the ship and swim to shore. And it's this really sort of coming of age story, learning how to be a leader story, because all of the people are like, hey, you're going too close to the reef, you'll crash us, and so forth and so on. Now, of course, Joseph Conrad is a really problematic author for us in the modern ages due to his viewpoints on Africa and race and all this other stuff. And there's a lot of debate in scholarship circles. And I know a lot of my friends of color really resent having to be forced to read him when you're in an English program. And all of that is totally true. And one of the interesting things when I was reading about this story is that I chose it to do a senior thesis paper on. And one of the pieces of further kind of complicating it was that he based that short story, which is famous and read by a lot of people, on an incident that actually happened in real life. And there's a captain of a ship, a real life ship, a T-Clipper, I think, who basically back then, ships' crews used to be far more integrated in real life. If you were a person of color, a person from a non-white country, one way you could kind of see the world and be in a more democratic area is to be on a crew, because it's just this little microcosm and people learn to trust each other based on competency. And so a lot of, even while on the mainland, there were tremendous amounts of racism and restriction of rights to people of color. When you were on a ship, in a lot of ships, it was a lot more meritocracy. It was much more of a meritocracy. And on this ship, this captain had been a complete racist and had killed, with what the crew thought was no sort of reason, a black crew member. And they mutinied. They basically tried to kill the captain. He locked himself into his room, and he was in this bay where it was like a complete like shark alley. And he jumped out of the back of his captain's cabin when they came to anchor, because they were going to drag him into court to try and get him to pay for his crime. And he jumped out and he swam to a neighboring ship and then got to land, and no one ever prosecuted him, and he got away with murder. And I was so outraged when I read what the real historical seed for the Secret Sharer was, because the Secret Sharer portrays both the stowaway and the captain, who basically aids and abets him, so sympathetically that I was always really furious. And so I wanted to flip that on its head. And so Zen and the Outer Starship Maintenance is a direct sort of call and response to the Secret Sharer, where I kind of make the stowaway the enemy that he should be.
And I don't want to give away the ending, Toby, but it's got a really, really clever classic science fiction ending.
Thank you.
Can you say sort of how you came up with it without giving it away, or is there anything you can say?
Oh man, that's really tough. This is the sort of ending that I've always wanted to have in a story. Like you said, it's that classic sort of ending. It's a very it's kind of, let's just say it's kind of like a reverse cold equations ending. It's the same sort of logic. It's the same sort of science thought all the way throughout to its inevitable conclusion. But it's also, a whole lot of cleverness on the part of the protagonist, who is going back and he's using a tactic that has been used going all the way back to, the original days of people being enslaved and having to fight back with the tools that they have to get what justice they can through whatever methods they have. And that's definitely what this character is then forced to fall back on. And so I was really excited in this story. And I hate it. I shouldn't say I hate it, but it feels awkward to toot your own horn. But I'm just really proud of this story, because it's a story where I was able to get that response to the Secret Sharer pulled in, and riff off of that, and riff off of this history I was reading about the Caribbean and some of the darker pieces of it, and also kind of have this dialogue with the three laws of robotics, and bring all those things together to make that ending bring all three of those threads together. Endings can be some of the toughest things to learn as a writer and to master. So whenever you can kind of nail it like that, it feels really, really, really satisfying.
I'm sort of struck, Toby, that you said you had just finished this big book, and now you have 7 days to write this short story. You're on this super tight deadline. And you're like, and so then I was reading A History of Grenada. You're always reading stuff like that, no matter how tight of a deadline you're on, or
you have to be reading. I mean, no matter how tight the deadline is, if you're not reading, you're killing yourself. And so that's where the raw ideas and that's where the raw stuff in the background comes from. And you never know what you're going to read that's going to spark what idea. So as I was coming up to the end of having finished this this really intense deadline, the very first thing I did the day after the deadline was pick up a book I had had on my to-read shelf for a long time. And my reading suffered over the last 2 years prior to the deadline. As my reading in 2016 and 2015 was a fraction of what it has been every year since, or every year before that. And so the moment I was done with that deadline, as I'm trying to come up with a story idea, I'm immediately picking this book off the shelf that I'd read like a small chunk of and purchased when I had been down at a literary conference down in the islands and brought back with me a year before I wrote the story. So, I finally, a year after buying the darn book, I open it up and I'm reading it as I'm trying to come up with some idea, and writing down stuff on pieces of paper for this anthology. And it was this sort of like memory of the secret sharer and, this chance article I'd read about the 3 laws of robotics. And then I'm also reading this book and thinking, oh my gosh, like I didn't plan this, but this book has 100% pertinence, and I read it in an evening, had it by my bedstand and was just reading it before I fell asleep. And that was kind of like, the next day I woke up and I'm like, oh my gosh, I think I can tie all these 3 things together in a really kind of engaging way.
Yeah. I mean, John and Becky, I know you both read Toby's story. Does anyone have anything else they want to ask about it or observations or anything?
Well, I just wanted to comment first that I loved it. I thought it was brilliant, and I thought
Oh, thank you so much.
The idea of, as someone who would love to upload herself into a computer, the idea that the trade-off would be free will was it was just a take on it I hadn't encountered before, and it really made me think. It really made me sit and chew on, well, would I? But the thing in listening to you talk about your inspiration for the story, that really makes me love what you did with the Formist, because the Formist idea of what it means to be human is not what I think most of us here in the real world would consider this is what it means to be human. The way the Formist is described is, having all of these mechanical or constructed parts, and yet this is the form he believes is pure and superior. And I think that's just so spot on, because if you're talking about bigotry, or you're talking about fundamentalism, all these ideas that this is the way it's always been and this is how it's, this is what is superior. Those ideas change, I mean, not even just by the century, but by the decade. We these things that people cling to as being, the best or this is how it's always been, are not true. We migrate and we mingle and we change ideas about how our families and society and all of it are constructed. And yet in every iteration, you have someone who looks at this thing and say, well, this is the best and this is how it's always been. And I think, I don't know, I just think that idea marries so well with what you did of this person who, to me, is inhuman, is very not human. And I don't know, I think that's really clever.
Wow. Thank you.
I mean, John, did you have something you were going to say?
I was just going to say that I'm really glad that I persevered and continued giving Toby extensions so that he had time to write the story, because it turned out so great, there's nothing in the book like this story, some of the other stories are like, okay, well, this one's kind of similar to this other one or whatever like that. But this story really stands apart. So, I'm really glad to have included it. And,
props to John, because he really worked hard editorially, because as I said, we only had the 7 days and I was burnt out. So even though I kind of had this idea, this seed that I'm very proud that I managed to pull together, and I'm very appreciative and quite honored that John, stuck with me for so long, but he really went above and beyond, not just in giving me the deadlines, but we worked really hard on the first few pages, because I was completely shot by the time I wrote the first draft. And so I got him a first draft that was very rough, and we had to keep going over it and working on it to bring it up to the place he needed. And for that, I'm extremely grateful, because I was in a place where I didn't have that in me at all to stick with the story that hard. So he really believed in it enough to kind of give me a lot of notes and work on the small stuff on it to get it to where it needed to be, because it was just sort of a Hail Mary pass and then collapse type thing when I got him the story. It was just a sort of, I will give him something that has these ideas within it, and if he turns it down, which I was like, I think this may be the first time he kind of throws up his hands and walks away, then I will then spend a month sleeping after this huge deadline, and then I'll come back to it and I'll just tinker it up, and I know I can sell it. I don't think it's quite ready. And he just kept with me for the rest of the week, just kind of sending edits back and kind of just keeping on me until he got me where I needed to be. And so that was above and beyond, and he didn't have to do that. And that was quite a team effort there.
I really like what Becky said too about that this Formist character thinks of himself as the pure human, even though he's super technologically advanced by our standards. And just this idea that this is how the world changes over the centuries, is that you can be the most hyper cyber enhanced dude in the world who can survive in vacuum and all this stuff, and you're the Amish in your society.
Yeah. No, there's definitely that that moment where you think this guy is as much a robot as the robot, as far as I can tell.
I also really want to ask you, Toby, I thought the Holy of Holies scene was really, really cool. Could you talk about that?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that was just, I'm not sure where I got that from. I was definitely thinking about, again, cosmic powers, sense of wonder, just things that are semi-mystical, which is something I often don't do a lot of, being more sort of hard SF or near future techno thriller. And so I definitely wanted to, one of the things John said was, sense of wonder. And I thought, man, I really need to tap into that as much as I can. So the Holy of Holies is sort of the idea of just the singularity of consciousness that is created as a priest, basically a confessor, something that you can go and talk to and that'll solve all your problems. It is sort of their future religion, and it's super technological, and yet there's something so mystical about it that it kind of combines both those things. And so that's what I set out to write. It's this singularity that creates itself around you when you go into the temple, that is an immense intelligent consciousness that sole purpose is to listen to what your problems are and try to help you with them and come up with some solutions and let you unburden yourself, and is sort of this highly encrypted device that destroys itself the moment you're done conversing with it, and is extremely moral. And what the robot does when it goes to seek counsel is give it some options on what it can do and nudge it in the right direction. And it's this sort of bizarre robot form goes into the confession booth, but hundreds of thousands of years in the future, what does that look like? And it's way more transcendental and has that sense of wonder and leaves you with this moment of kind of touching the divine as a result of having this discussion, and then you leave. And those were all the emotions I was trying to evoke with it.
Yeah, I think that's just so cool that, you can confess your secrets to this thing, and that it's not going to tell anyone because it's going to cease to exist at the end of this session, basically.
Well, because that's what I would want out of a confession booth. I don't want a human being who's going to turn around and be like, that guy.
But that also ties in with what Becky was saying earlier about how frequently Catholic imagery shows up in this kind of far future science fiction.
Yeah, and I was thinking of it as Toby was speaking just now, and I think he hit the nail right on the head. It's touching the divine, right? It's that sense of wonder we get when we look out there, when we imagine, what life in space could be like. I think I think that actually really clarified what the appeal is for me, or at least why I included a little, a bit of that in my story as well. When you're talking about science fiction, even if you're writing about aliens and spaceships and stuff. Like in my work, at least, I try to keep it grounded. Yeah, we're gonna have all this fantastic technology and stuff, but I want it to feel plausible. But if you get into the realm of fantasy, and that's not to say that I don't want to insult anyone here by saying religion and fantasy belong in the same category, but I think it's that
I don't think you're going to insult anyone here by saying that.
Okay, well, I'm just trying not to dig a trench here. But what it is I think it's that inexplicable, right? That it's that mystery. And that's something where, that's the opposite of science, right? Science is there to uncover the mystery, where if it's just pure mystery and awe, that's the realm of religion. And I think that's I don't know. I'm making this up as I go, but I would guess that that's why we see so much of that stuff in this type of science fiction, where we're going beyond what we can understand. We're going beyond what we can puzzle out and what we can rationalize, and we're instead going into something that is awesome in the original meaning of the word.
I mean, John, do you want to talk a little bit about this idea of gods and sort of putative gods, fake gods in this kind of galactic science fiction that we see in this book? Because that shows up a bunch of times in these different stories.
Yeah. I mean, well, and I'm kind of glad that kind of thing did show up, because I mean that seems like it's really part and parcel of this whole kind of story that I was looking for. Like, I mean, if I imagine like Silver Surfer, like half the time Silver Surfer's hanging out in the cosmos and between planets, like talking to some kind of god thing. It's like the living tribunal, or like the manifestations of order or chaos or whatever. Like, these. It's like, so I love the idea that, like some of the stories is like, oh, well, we're walking around on the head of a dead god, or, like you say, there's these putative gods and such in there. I thought it was interesting that, when you guys were bringing up the idea that there's these corollaries to like Catholicism and such, that hadn't actually occurred to me, but it makes so much sense now that you say it. I think, the whole sort of, the whole notion of sort of gods as these sort of extra dimensional or, extra dimensional beings of some sort that sort of exist outside of like the known, laws of physics as we know them. I think that's like a cool way of like incorporating those sorts of, ideas, but in a science fictional, framework that you can't really do otherwise, like unless you just throw the rules down and be like, let's just step over this one and this one and this one and not worry about it too much.
Well, I love, John, in the Adam Troy Castro story that they have the Yahweh scale that they use to measure these
right,
these space gods.
Yeah, that was cool.
So basically, Yahweh would be 100 on the Yahweh scale, and a human being would be a 0.1, and then the different everything they encounter, in this story they run into a 23.6, which is just like, oh my god, they run into a 31.9, which is like, and it's an exponential scale too, so a 31.9 is a really, really powerful space god.
Well, I had to put 5 years of Anglican school to good use.
Yeah, as I was saying, I didn't notice the Catholic, sort of corollaries that you guys are talking about. It's like I actually did go to Catholic school when I was a kid, and Christy often mentions how I'm like the worst Catholic ever. I mean, I'm an atheist now, but I mean, it's like you went to Catholic school and you don't know any of this stuff. It's like she'll mention some reference to the Bible and I just stare at her blankly, and it's just like the depth of my ignorance about the biblical things is pretty profound, and I'm happy to keep it that way.
But I mean, this idea of spaceships running into gods in space, I feel is not super explored in science fiction. I mean, it makes me think of Star Trek V, or there's this book by John Scalzi called The God Engines, which I haven't read.
I was just going to mention that, yes.
I mean, I haven't read it. Toby, could you talk about what... Does that sound... that's pretty much what we're talking about, or...?
In the God Engines... Well, what they do in the God Engines is they harness gods to make faster-than-light travel. So you kind of capture a god and put it in manacles in the middle of a starship, and you can head out and explore the galaxy. And basically, the novella, The God Engines, basically runs with that. And it's a very, very dark, very cosmic powers-ish sort of novella that John wrote that's really not in what people expect as his usual style.
Mm-hmm.
But a good read. Absolutely.
It's more what? More sort of dense prose or something, or?
He's usually mostly dialogue and a lot of funny. He's funny, light, fast, and this is really sort of deeply dark. It's a dark piece.
Huh.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, the idea of like chaining gods into the center of your ship and like, torturing them to create faster than light travel is not a happy dialogue heavy romp through the galaxy.
But that would be an interesting challenge to write that as a comedy,
Well, John would probably be up for the task. He's one of the masters of that kind of fun experience in our genre. But no, it was like I would call it like dark fantasy science fiction.
Mm-hmm. So some of the things we were just talking about reminded me. So, when I was describing the book, I thought it might actually be interesting to hear like the actual description that I gave the authors, and then to see what stories they came up with. But Toby mentioned how I kept pushing sense of wonder and stuff, and so basically I described it in a one-line summary as just like an anthology of cosmic space opera-esque science fantasy. But then I drilled down a little bit and said I described the story parameters as stories should take place out in the cosmos, on spaceships and/or in space, with heroes battling larger-than-life forces with the fate of planets, galaxies, or even the universe itself at stake. Stories that feel like science fiction, but push everything past the limits of believability. And additionally, I wanted the guiding principles of the anthology to be fun and sense of wonder. And I put fun and sense of wonder in all caps. And then I said that all of the stories should be full of those two things. And so that was like what I was really wanting people to go for. And I think they did really well. I also then dropped in some pop culture reference points as to sort of like, kind of like Guardians of the Galaxy, Silver Surfer, Infinity Gauntlet, Green Lantern, and to a lesser extent Star Wars. And so basically, throw that all into a writer blender and, this anthology is what got churned out.
I mean, you were telling me, John, there's this story by Joseph Allen Hill that you were saying really fit that description of what you sent out.
Yeah. Yeah, no, so, I mean, I love that story so much, and I'm really excited about him as a writer. Like, he also wrote this great story called The Venus Effect that I published last year. That's one of my favorites from, all year. But yeah, Infinite Love Engine, man, like, it was just like, it just like hit like exactly like what I was imagining this anthology would be. Like, I mean, like some of the stories, like, I love them just as much, but they didn't quite. It's not quite what I initially pictured. But that's part of the reason why I love them. It's like, oh, that's not what I was expecting, but this is fantastic. But then his story is like, oh, no, this is like torn out of my brain and just like put on the page. It's like, so it's so great when you see something like that. And like, the Dan Abnett story is the other one like that I thought was like that. And the stories are actually kind of very similar. Probably mostly because they're very similar to Guardians of the Galaxy. Which is not surprising on Dan Abnett's part because he actually wrote Guardians of the Galaxy. The main comic series that the movie was based on was from his run. The Joseph Allen Hill story. It's like there's this like telepathic space monster who is like compelling love from everyone in the universe, and there's this sort of apathetic space warrior woman who has to try to stop it, and it's just written in this wonderful it's just the voice is so great. It's just like one of the things I've been trying to do when I publish anthologies recently is like I'll try to publish a few of the stories or make sure a few of the stories are available online in order to try to help people find the books and everything. And so for Infinite Love Engine, I actually took that one and I published it in Lightspeed like in April, so sort of almost simultaneously with the anthology. And then in the anthology, technically it's the reprint there because just because of the timing. So because of that, it appears in Lightspeed and it also appeared on our podcast. And so I actually went and listened to the podcast version afterward. And so it was really great. It was just really fun, like, reliving it and everything. And it's like, I honestly, I feel like I could just listen to it a couple more times too. So.
Well, that story is really interesting because the main character speaks in this very sort of streetwise, vernacular, contemporary, way of speaking. And then that's juxtaposed with the like crazy robots and gods and things in a way that's just really interesting.
Yeah. I love like the way she talks with the space or the brain cube thing, and it's just like the initial she's like in this like blobby space creature thing that she's traveling through space in, like instead of in a spaceship, and like her conversations with that thing right at the start of the story, it's quite a trip.
Yeah, and then she has the philosophical argument with the robot. It's just there's a lot of cool stuff.
Oh,
in the
yeah.
story.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of fun.
And then you mentioned the Dan Abnett thing too. That has some of the best written action I've ever seen in a story.
Right? Yeah, no, so it's funny. So the reviews, like I had mentioned, had been largely very good, and this one review was actually very positive. They really liked the anthology, but they didn't like that story very much. And and the complaint was that it was like too hard to suspend disbelief. And I'm like, dude, like you got all the way through this book, and then you got to that story, and then you're like, oh, I just can't believe this. This is too weird. It's like, come on, that's the whole book. It's like the whole book is like that. And so like I don't know how to react to that kind of reaction to it. But yeah, no, I mean it's so great. Yeah, it's like the action.
So they made it past the Charlie Jane Anders story without having any like plausibility
I know, right?
issues, but
Right. I know it's kind of bizarre, but yeah, no, I mean that story is so great. I was like that and a couple of the other stories in the book. When I read them, I wanted to swear in the acceptance letter because it was like so fucking good. It's like it's a little unprofessional to say that like in an email when you're accepting a story, so I restrained myself. But like after the fact, I can say, oh, the story was so fucking good, you know. So
man, I would love to hear some swearing in an acceptance letter sometime.
I had an acceptance letter once that was all caps and swearing, and it's the best acceptance letter I've ever received.
Okay,
yeah, I don't think you got to hold back, John.
Yeah, well, see, the thing is, it's you kind of got to know your audience, though. So it's like, okay, I've talked to you guys. I realize that you guys are cool with it now, and it's like if I knew Dan Abnett a little bit better, maybe I would have sworn at him when I emailed him. I mean, he probably would have been fine, but you know, I don't really know him that well, so I don't want to push my luck.
I mean, you mentioned, John, that he wrote the Guardians of the Galaxy comic book sequence that kind of inspired the movie. Do you know is that all you know about that, or do you know any more details about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much. I don't know much beyond that. But I mean, his run was basically the inspiration. It's like his iteration of those characters is what the movie was basically based on. So yeah, that's about all I know, though.
Huh. I also wanted to mention the Karl Trader story, which is set in the same universe as his novel Lockstep, which I thought was just fantastic. I interviewed him about it. I interviewed him about that book a year or two ago. And Toby, I know you're buds with Karl, right? You guys collaborated on some stuff together?
Yeah, I love Karl. He's awesome.
Have you been in touch with him lately?
Briefly.
Did he? I don't know if he'd said anything to you about Lockstep or the story or anything?
He didn't tell me anything about the story, and I haven't read it yet. Lockstep, I remember when he was first coming up with the idea for the Lockstep universe, and I friggin' love it. He was telling me the whole idea of, you know, people sleeping in cycles so that they're all together across the interstellar differences, no faster than light. In fact, he told me that there's a character named Toby in Lockstep. That's kind of a pat on the back towards me. And I used the Lockstep idea because he told me it's great and he's trying to get people to use it. I loved it so much that Karen Lord and I used it in a story called The Mighty Slinger, which is in Bridging Infinity by Jonathan Strahan. Sorry, John, your competition. But it's about a group of calypso singers who are basically using lockstep in order to stay in sync in their working parties. They kind of work on asteroids all over the solar system. And they use, you know, basically you go to sleep, you know, a la, you know, Aliens or whatever, you kind of go into your suspended animation, but you all do it together so that you're all kind of in the same cohort. And so the Lockstep universe is really fascinating to me in terms of a way of solving the large distance problems with you know, the really long travel distances and really slow economies.
Yeah, that's whenever somebody asks me, have I come across any cool new science fiction ideas recently? That's definitely one that I'll mention. The Lockstep idea, I just think is so brilliant. And
it's brilliant.
It's one of those things like it has to be in science fiction. You know, how it's never get.
Karl is one of the more original science fiction thinkers we have out there in terms of those hardcore concepts. I mean, the lockstep concept, his concept of thalliance, and a few other things that he's posted in his books. Like I joke with people that I've kind of made a career out of grabbing some of his ideas and just running with them, because I can take stuff that he spins out and write a whole book about it and kind of go like, woohoo, you know. The idea for my novel Arctic Rising came out of the conversation that he had when we co-wrote a short story together called Mitigation, which was about what happens when the Arctic North becomes an actual ocean and it no longer has any freeze. And he tossed out a bunch of ideas when we were working on that story. And when I came up with the idea to write Arctic Rising, I kind of circled back to him and I said, hey, do you mind if I use some of these ideas that, you know, you came up with and I helped, but I kind of felt like I was a bystander for quite a bit of mitigation. And he was like, no, someone should write a novel about this. These are ideas I'm just trying to get out there. So, you know, much respect to him. I'm whenever I get together with him, I always go home with just tons and tons of notes and new books to read, because he's just a smart cookie.
Well, right. I mean, because, you know, like in your story, Toby, you mentioned there's the formist versus the non-formist. There's a really interesting philosophical debate like that in this story, where it's between they're called the maximizers and the non-maximizers or whatever, where basically there's been this discovery that the universe is infinite, in time is infinite. It stretches infinitely into the past and the future. And so one implication of that is that nothing that you do matters in any kind of moral sense, because everything that you do that's good will be canceled out by something that you have done and will do infinitely in the future and past that's bad. And so people, having come to this realization, are there's a certain faction called the maximizers, who they think, well, if nothing that I do matters, I might as well just do whatever feels good right now.
Right.
And so they've become this sort of, you know, like selfish hedonists kind of faction. And I don't know, I thought I was kind of talking about that same sort of idea with time travel with James Glick when I interviewed him a couple months ago, but I thought it was interesting that, of course, Karl got there before me.
Yeah, I was going to say, when Toby was describing Karl as one of the most original thinkers and that stuff, I was thinking the same thing. He's like this great science fictional thinker. Like his stories and novels and such are always full of so many great ideas. It's like it's hard to keep up with them all. So
it's hard to keep up with them all, and it's always criminal to me that he is not more widely read.
Yeah.
I mean, John, are there any other stories in this book you kind of want to mention to just bring people's attention to? Give them an idea of what other kind of things are in this book?
Yeah, sure. Well, you know, we mentioned how Becky's novels are up for some of the major awards this year. Yoon-Ha Lee is also up for the Hugo, the Nebula, and the Clark Award, all for his first novel, Nine Fox
Triple
Gambit.
play.
Yeah, and this story takes place in the same universe as that. So if you're familiar with that novel, then you know this story, The Chameleon's Gloves, that takes place in the same universe. But
actually, let me just mention, John, there's a really interesting idea in this story. From speaking of the title, where the title is The Chameleon's Gloves, and so one of the ideas in this story is that there's these characters called Haptic Chameleons, where they're basically so good at imitating people's body language, like their way of walking and things, that they can fool machines that recognize people by their gaits. And they can kind of fool people if you're not paying attention, where you just think you think it's somebody else because they're walking and moving their body just like that person does. And one thing I think is really cool, like in these kind of cosmic powers kind of stories, is that you want the societies to not just be exactly like our society, but to have other weird quirks and things. And one thing in this story I thought was really cool is that the characters from this particular civilization, they sort of view their hands the way that we view our genitals, where they keep them covered all the time and they sort of feel weird about them. And so there's this part where one of the characters intentionally takes off their gloves and is kind of rubbing their hands in order to make the person from this civilization uncomfortable. You know, I thought that was a cool detail.
Nine Fox Gambit was a really standout novel of last year. It's not surprising to me that it's being nominated for all those awards. I really enjoyed it. And to this day, I get to the end of every email and want to write yours in calendrical heresy.
Otherwise, I was going to say, we mentioned it earlier, but Charlie Jane Anders' story, it's the first story in the book. So, I mean, obviously, one of the things that anthologists do, we put two of the stories we think are strongest at the beginning and end of an anthology. And so, her story, starts the book and Dan Abnett's ends the book. Obviously I thought hers was very good example of what the book is, trying to do. It's really zany. It's like the zaniest, thing that I can remember reading in recent memory. It has a spaceship in it called the Spicy Meatball. So, I mean, that kind of tells you almost everything you need to know about what kind of story you're in for. And it's called a temporary embarrassment in space-time, which I love. I love that.
That's such a great title.
Phrase. Yeah. I mean, that was another one that I thought was really a lot of fun. I mean, it's just, it's hard to pick any favorites. Anytime you do an anthology that you're really happy with, it's like there's so many great stories in there. It's hard to pick and choose, and you don't want to leave anybody out. You don't want to leave anybody out. But so I leave it to people like you, Dave, to say which ones that you think was best, because you don't have the personal connection to it.
Well, yeah. I mean, I told you I think that the Dan Abnett one and Toby's one, I think, were my top two. And then I had Becky's story right up there, number 4 or something. So, I mean, you've got some excellent writers here on this panel. I mean, Becky, is there anything you want to add about anything we've been saying? Anything you want to throw in?
Nothing in particular, except that I too loved Charlie Jane Anders' story. I was grinning all the way through it. It was just so off the wall and so much fun. And even though I'm obviously in this anthology, picking it up and reading that, it just made me excited to keep reading. It was, I haven't read any stories like this in such a long time. It did feel like something from my childhood or something from, I don't know, the good old days. So it was, I don't know. I think, biased as I am, I think this is a real treat. I think it's so much fun, and it's something I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I'm so looking forward to taking some time to just, cozy up and go explore.
Isn't it fantastic when you can read something as an adult who's read a ton of work that sort of you enjoy and brings back a sense of wonder? That's like a real treat.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I obviously read all the time, but it was the most fun I've had reading in a while. It was just it made me feel like I was, a kid in the library again. just excited,
Mission accomplished.
Well done, John. Well done indeed.
I guess I'm just a little curious, Becky. I mean, you've just started publishing novels, and I guess you're probably starting to go to conventions and meet people and stuff. Have you met any or many of the authors in this book?
Not many. Actually, I'm not sure I've met any at all. That's not true. I met Shannon McGuire at the LA Times Festival of Books a couple weeks ago. But I'm still very much a newbie here, shaking hands and whatnot.
I mean, you told us that you went on a book tour, right? Or you just got back from a book tour? Or?
Well, yeah. So I had 2 weekends of events. Basically, I did a number of events in Orlando, and then I was off to the LA Times Festival of Books. So that was a lot of fun. I got to go to Kennedy Space Center and do an event there, and so that was kind of, I don't know, made all the editing and deadlines worth it to have that day.
Well, because you were with an astronaut, right?
That's right. Yeah.
That's so cool.
It was absolutely incredible. Yeah, I did a panel with astronaut Don Thomas. He was a 4-time shuttle astronaut. Really wonderful, kind man. And he and I talked about human spaceflight for an hour. I would set it up as you do. It was set up as a fact versus fiction panel where I would bring up popular or common tropes in sort of popular depictions of human spaceflight. Things like, launch being, as easy as sort of, bringing a small plane up, or space madness, or, sleek spacesuits, and then I'd fire it off to him to be like, okay, so what's it really like to go through these things? And not so much obviously there was quite a bit of like picking apart the actual science of it, but what I was really after was, what was your experience? What does it feel like to be in launch? What does it feel like to look down at Earth? Those sorts of things. So it was a wonderful conversation, and one of those where I sat through the whole thing just like, sound smart, just just pinching myself the whole time. We spend in our genre so much time talking about space travel in the abstract, sitting with someone who has been there, who's really been there and can talk about these things, where space is not just this concept or a story setting for him. It's a place he has been. It's a place he's lived. And it was just such an incredible privilege.
How did that event come about?
That was done through Harper Voyager, who's my publisher stateside. They did a sweepstakes for, the winner would get 4 days in Florida. They'd get to go to Star Wars Celebration. They'd get to go to Kennedy Space Center. They'd get to hang out with me, and they'd get a library of Harper Voyager books. So I was very happy to go along for that ride.
See, because you have a lot of family that's been involved with NASA, right? Were they really excited to see you up there with the astronaut?
Yeah, well, so my dad, he's retired now, but he was a civilian aerospace engineer. My mom is an astrobiology educator, and she does consulting stuff with NASA and JPL. And my maternal grandfather, he was a mathematician. He worked on Apollo and later the shuttle. So it's very much in my family. And yeah, when I told my folks I was going to Kennedy Space Center, I had two reactions. One was my dad, who says, "Well, you're going to go see the Saturn V, right?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, well, Dad, I'm there to work. Like, I don't know how much time." "Well, you got to go see the like, if you go all the way there and you don't see the Saturn V." So I made time to see the Saturn V, and I say that begrudgingly. It was one of the it was just a monumental experience. But I also knew my dad would kill me if I didn't go. And then my mom and I were laughing about it because I was there that week. And the week following, she was off to, NASA was sending her off to an astrobiology conference in Phoenix. So it was kind of like, and that for me was a really good feeling like I'd picked up the family torch in that regard.
Yeah, so you were destined to become either a science fiction writer or a scientist. You had no other choice, really.
I had zero other choice. Actually, my parents were. I'm the weird artsy one in the family. I'm the only one who didn't go into a STEM field. But my parents were very good about that. They were very good about both, communicating the importance of scientific literacy without pushing me in that direction. They were they really just introduced me to all the stuff out there. So in some ways, yeah, I mean, I did absorb a lot of it through osmosis, but I also was encouraged to find my own way. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, because in some ways I look at my childhood and I say, well, yeah, it was inevitable. I grew up loving space, but in some ways it feels also like I chose it on my own. There are other things my parents introduced me to that I didn't take interest in, and space was the one where I grabbed on hard and was like, yeah, I'm hitching my wagon to this.
I also wanted to ask you, John, I mean, this book has a really, really cool cover by Chris Voss, who's this great science fiction illustrator whose books I grew up with. Is there anything to say about how the cover came about?
Yeah, apparently it was not a very interesting story, and I didn't have anything to do with it, but Joe Monti, he just, he found out how to get in touch with Foss and just got him to do it. It's like he just hit him at the right time, like sometimes as you do, like sometimes when you land, some great participant to a project like this, like sometimes the timing is just all that matters, and it's like you just hit him at the right time. But he was just like, I haven't done a science fiction book cover in a long time. Yeah, why not? Let's do it. So I mean, that was all there was to it, basically. But yeah, no, I know. I mean, every time I post the cover, like I'll get a bunch of people. It's like, oh wow, that looks just like a Chris Foss cover, and I'm like, it is Foss, and then they're like, oh my god, their minds are just blown. It's great.
That's what Twitter was like, right? When I first posted the cover, people kept saying like, oh man, that looks exactly like one of those old, great Chris Foss covers that I grew up on, and you could just reply with like, it is.
Right.
That was really cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I first talked to Saga about the book and everything, and I had, although it didn't occur to me stupidly to invite Ron Mars to write a story, it did occur to me at some point to say, oh, hey, maybe we can see if Ron Lim could do the cover. But I don't know if they actually pursued that. But I mean, this is a very good alternative.
Okay, well, so Toby, I also wanted to ask you. You mentioned that you have a new Halo book that you just finished. So obviously I have to ask you, how prominently does Dante Kirtley feature in this new book?
Didn't he die horribly in the last one?
Yo, dude, like there's cloning, there's time travel.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Kirtley did not make a reappearance. You don't get that one again. Yeah, that was a one-time deal, man. I killed Dante Kirtley horribly in that previous book. I killed a number of friends in the Cole Protocol. It's just was a fun thing to sneak in there. When you're an author having fun, it's just a way to get some of that, get some of your friends in there, and if they're a close friend, kill them horribly.
He's paid his debt to you, Dave. Get over it. It's done. You're not going to get it anymore. It's not anymore. No more appearances.
But you're forever memorialized in the Halo universe now.
So wait, are you going to tell us about the new book though, as if I care?
Oh. It's there are my dogs barking in the background. That's awesome. The new book is a lot of fun, because one of the things about Halo is that there's a great moment in it that is, for Halo fans, kind of fun. There's a species that was mentioned in passing in one of the sort of notes around the first game that they were going to have it included in the first game, called the Sharkoi. And one of the things I got to do in this book is actually sort of bring them into Halo canon and put them into a book. And Halo fans are pretty excited about that. So that's a spoiler right there. Sorry, everyone who's listening. But that was fun to be given like an entire species to play with, and it's fun to play with the video game universe again. I've played most of the Halo video games, although my Xbox One just died, so I'm just crushed. But so I didn't get a chance to play Halo Wars 2 because it's not booting up at all, and I need to get around to getting a new one. But I've played most of the Halo games and had a lot of fun with them, so getting a chance to play in the universe a second time has been a lot of fun. And most of the fans have been really nice to me in terms of their reactions to this one, at least on Twitter.
Why is it called Envoy?
Envoy. It's called Envoy because there is a ambassador who's been sent from United Earth government, and their goal is to sort of like broker a peace between the alien elites, if you've ever played the game, the Sangheili, and the humans who live there. I kind of got a chance to put both alien elites and human beings together on a single planet. And it is underneath this planet that there's the great threat, the Sharkoi, that have been stored for a very long time. And they kind of like get back into action and cause a lot of trouble. And it's also about use of violence and the power of being an envoy and an ambassador, and this character's attempts to solve problems, not necessarily through always violence, but just being clever. So it's it was fun to write. It was fun to write. It's just it was crammed into a space that came right after writing two other books. So it was it's been a very intense 2 years. I'm so relieved to have it out. It's just sort of like this huge burden off of my shoulders, in terms of, not that it was a burden to write, but just in terms of like I had like 3 projects that just came one right after the other. And so for the last 2 years, I've written 3 books, and I'm just enjoying right now working at my own pace for the first time in 2 years.
That sounds really cool. So, Toby, I saw that you had a tweet that went viral a day or so ago. What's it like being a viral Twitter star?
Well, a lot of people yell at you in all caps on the internet. That's what it feels like to be a viral tweet star. The tweet that I sent out was just Consumer Reports basically posted something about the high number of bankruptcies has been slashed in half from 2010 to 2017. And they posted a chart that showed the dramatic drop in bankruptcies. It's gone from 1.5 million bankruptcies a year down to 700 and something thousand bankruptcies a year. A very dramatic and sudden shift. And they did some interviews and they talked to some data scientists. And while they don't have an exact number, a large number of that is attributed to the passing of ACA, in 2010. So
The Obamacare.
Obamacare, yeah. And well, I mean, there's some people who don't know that Obamacare is ACA. So that's like really frustrating, isn't it? So as a result of that, they put together a quick article and I retweeted it and I just said, basically, not expecting it to go viral. I was just like, look, ACA has cut bankruptcies in half, what a headline. And that got retweeted. Right now it's 9,500 retweets and still climbing. So it looks like it's going to head towards 10,000. That's a lot of retweets. My previous record was like 290 retweets on something I said that was vaguely clever. And to have the difference between 290 and 10,000 is quite daunting, actually. So, of course, the first thing that happened was, lots of people retweeting and agreeing. And then
didn't Adam Savage retweet it or something?
Friggin' Adam! I mean, talk about like winning the geek lottery there. That was just wild. I mean, they're just people retweeting it who I read in regular life. Let me just say this. It was really strange to be reading my regular Twitter feeds and to see my, thing pop up. And you're just like, what is happening here? This is so strange. So yeah, there was a lot of blowback. I wrote an article to follow up on it because a lot of people were upset. They said a lot of people assumed I wrote this article for Consumer Reports, and so they were challenging me on the data and getting really angry at me for having written this and really angry at me for manipulating the data. And so I, kind of dug into the data a little bit more because a lot of people were arguing directly with me instead of Consumer Reports. And I kind of was ending up in the position of having to defend Consumer Reports, which is really weird because normally I just pay them a lot of money and get that little digest and they do great research for me and keep me away from buying crappy things. So the interesting thing about it was that, they definitely showed a chart that had 2010 to 2017, which, as everyone knows, like if you chop off the axis, that's slightly, you can prove your point by manipulating a chart. And so a lot of people started sending me charts that showed 2007 to 2017, where the rate had been under 1 million and had gone up to 1.5 million and then back down to 700,000 to show that I was manipulating data and being a very horrible liberal. I think the word libtard was what kept being used. So
fake news.
Well, fake news was like, okay, so the responses were libtard, fake news, manipulating the chart, and correlation isn't causation, which was the most common one, actually. A number of people just tweeted at me, correlation is not causation, and that's it. And then I would try to get them to engage and they would just like not respond. So I found this really great comic online that I posted up onto my website that shows a kid standing in front of a big flat screen TV with a remote puncturing it, and he's talking to his mom. She looks real mad at him. Grr. And he's like, correlation is not causation. So yeah, I had to go back and find charts that had bankruptcy data that go all the way back to the 1970s and post it for people that showed that bankruptcy had gone all the way up to 2.1 million bankruptcies a year until they passed legislation during the Bush administration in 2005 that kind of tried to make bankruptcy legal, right? They just kind of like said, not illegal, but they basically radically made it harder for you to go through bankruptcy. And so 2006 and 2007, the number of bankruptcies dropped from 2.1 million down to 700,000 just because the Bush administration made it much harder and sort of put these artificial caps on bankruptcy law that hadn't been there before to just force it down. And from 2007 all the way through 2010, over this like 2-year period, basically bankruptcies just screamingly accelerate from 700,000 a year back up to 1.5 million. And we're headed for 2.1 million again. And we know from research done by various consumer agencies and places like Consumer Reports and bankruptcy court laws that people have studied that somewhere between prior to ACCA, that somewhere around 50% of all bankruptcies are medically related. It's remarkably the most common reason for bankruptcy among personal bankruptcies. And so we know that what happened was that it just went screaming back up to what it was before. When it hit 1.5 million. And then since ACCA over the last 7 years, it's just been steadily dropping and dropping and dropping each year. So yeah, I spent a lot of time just basically having to try to engage people with that, which I didn't have to do. But I figured maybe 1 out of every 20 of those people who called me a libtard was maybe amenable to looking at facts. I don't know.
Well, and this is really personal to you, Toby, right? Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is this is incredibly personal to me. And today, as we're recording this, is a very frustrating day because I went to a town hall meeting recently for my own member of Congress and stood up and asked him the question, what are those of us with pre-existing conditions, going to do if this AHCA passes, which is, Trump care? And he promised me to my face that, people who, had pre-existing conditions were not going to get screwed over by any legislation he backed. And what was passed today basically kind of screws people with pre-existing conditions. It tries to force us off into high-risk pools, which will dramatically increase our cost of insurance, or actually with pre-existing conditions, in some cases, they're going to not offer us insurance. Before I became a full-time writer, I was not able to access healthcare on the private insurance market because I have a genetic heart condition. This isn't something that I got from leading a bad life or because I'm a bad person. I'm born with it. Like my grandfather had it, my mom has it, I have it. And as long as I take decent care of myself, which I do, I will probably not die of it. I'll probably die of something else. My doctor says, hey, it's probably more likely you'll die of cancer, but there's a chance this might kill you. So I have a pre-existing condition and there's nothing I can do about it. It's genetic. And that means that in this country, as a result of the political situation we have, I might lose my health care through no fault of my own very soon here. So it is extremely personal to me. And then the secondary thing is that we have to make some decisions about my children. Originally, I really wanted to screen them, do genetic screening to see if they had it so that we could make some good choices about whether they can be in sports or what they can do moving forward in life, and whether or not we need to monitor and be careful about this. Now I'm not going to get that screening because I don't want to know. I don't, for their sake, as they grow up and when they'll have healthcare, I don't want it on their record that they have a pre-existing condition. So right now we will just leave that off the table, and that's frustrating, and it shouldn't be like that, and it sucks, and it's unfortunate. And it makes me very, very angry. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at my Twitter and Facebook feed, I mean, all my, so many of my friends are writers, and people are just,
writers are so screwed right now.
Despondent,
Yeah. No, I mean, so many people who have small businesses or who are writers or who are freelancers. I don't know, Becky, you said you were doing freelance work. Are you affected by this?
Well, I'm writing fiction full time now, but yeah, I mean, it affects me hugely. Writing is my business, and I just my hopes are not currently very high that I'll be able to. I mean, I'll keep writing for sure, but if the changes they're talking about go through, it will make my job a lot harder. Not my job, not like the day to day, but my ability to do this job.
Yeah.
And to go to the doctor, which is a good thing to do from time to time. It is
good. And it's not just us freelancers that are going to get hit by this bill, but I just discovered that what this bill does is also it takes off lifetime caps for people with employer insurance. So if you, right before ACCA, over 50% of people who had health insurance through their employers had lifetime caps on them. So if you happen to get cancer and you went through $1 million worth of treatment, you would then from then on not be able to get covered. You'd have to pay for everything from that million on out of your own pocket, which is why we were having so many bankruptcies. So it's not just us freelancers who are about to get royally slammed by this, but it's a lot of people in this country. And that's stunning to me.
I mean, one of our our listeners, Nicholas Rogers posted on Facebook, if I have the details right, that his daughter needed a heart transplant shortly after she was born and, went through all the, hit the lifetime cap before she was 1 month old or something.
Wow. Yeah, that the lifetime caps and the pre-existing conditions thing, they're just going to be brutal to people when if it passes the Senate, and it is a cruel and horrible thing that they've done. It's and like you said, very dispiriting, but it's well, I mean, it's just wow.
John, do you have anything you want to add?
Not really. I mean, I'm affected by it too. We have insurance through the ACA and had been turned down prior to the ACA for having pre-existing conditions and things. So, but yeah, I don't know, man. It's like it's really hard to even look at the news and everything with all this kind of stuff going on. And I mean, that's not even the end of it. I mean, there's so many other. I mean, there's so many other things that are happening there. It's like it's hard to devote all my outrage to one thing because there's all these other things that are happening. So it's like, that feels like it's probably a strategy, but it's really troubling. I mean, hopefully this won't get through the Senate because it got through the House, but then it still has to get through the Senate, and it might not, and they might change it in the Senate, and it's all stupidly complicated. Although, as our president said, no one knew health insurance was this complicated. But yeah, anyway, it's really depressing.
Well, as a writer, I remember being, I started getting into the genre heavily, 2000 to 2006 as I started publishing short stories and then my first novel. And I remember at some of the conventions I was at, just talking to all these full-time writers who were ahead of me. And they, so many of them didn't have healthcare. And before 2010, there were so many bankruptcies and there were so many writers who lost everything and were, needing help. It was so common. And there were so many stories that it was really dispiriting, I remember at that time. And one of the most common conversations prior to 2010 was consistently like, how can freelancers get healthcare? How can we protect ourselves? And for this brief and shining moment from 2010, to 2017, the 7-year period, was an explosion of writer friends of mine taking the risk to go full time, to create more, to make more, to do more, because they had the ability to buy health insurance.
Yeah, so it's like you guys are saying, it's depressing, and I would much rather be talking about evil space gods, but
any day.
This is important stuff. And if you're listening to this and you're not on the same side of this as us, I would just really strongly encourage you to just listen, just seek out stories of people like us and our writer friends, because these are all real people. And
well, the most brutal thing about that viral tweet was just how many. I have to say, the hardest thing psychologically, and the reason I lost most of yesterday to engaging with people instead of actually, I was supposed to have read Cosmic Powers yesterday and have read all the stories so I could sound really erudite and up on everything. But instead, I was reading everyone's tweets telling me about all the bankruptcies they'd gone through and all the horrible choices they'd had to make as a result of these staggering health bills and all the things that they'd lost because of bankruptcies. And it was just a psychic storm of just pain that got dumped on me. And that wasn't malicious. I mean, I can deal with people who disagree with me kind of calling me a libtard. I don't care. I have oppositional defiant disorder. Whenever someone does something like that, it makes me just delightfully...
And now you're never getting any treatment for that.
Yeah, I know. I just get delightfully happy when people get angry with me for some reason. I have to actually really be careful to control that so that I don't purposely try to get people outraged at me. But the things that really, really hit me hard were the number of people who had gone through tremendous pain and suffering and financial collapse as a result of pre-2010 healthcare conditions and the way that things were set up against them. And I came very close to that situation myself when I ended up in the hospital for quite a while when we discovered that I had this genetic heart defect. I mean, in end of 2008, early 2009, I racked up some serious medical debt and, stared bankruptcy in the face and worked my ass off to get out of it and pay everything off myself, because I just come from that blue collar background. I had millionaire friends who kind of back channeled to me and they're just like, yeah, just declare bankruptcy. But I paid everything off and am still suffering from the fallout from that long period of paying all that debt off. And knowing that there were lifetime caps, knowing that there were yearly caps was just this tremendous sense of security that started up in 2010. The knowledge that I would never have to look at $40,000 worth of medical bills in any given year.
Yeah. All right. So, yeah, let's talk about.
Well, to circle all that back to art, it's easier to create art when you're not terrified of all that. And art is fun. Art is fun to make. Let's go there.
Yeah, the only solace I can take is that everyone who voted yes for the repeal will someday face judgment at the hands of the living tribunal.
Can I just say, John, also one of the stories I'm actually looking forward to reading in here, to go on a happy note, is you published a story by Linda Nagata, Diamond and the World Breaker. And I love it when Linda does really far future, crazy, far out there stuff. Her novel Memory, which I think she's now has the rights to and has up on Amazon, but I read it back when it had just come out from Tor, is one of my favorite sort of far future sense of wonder. Magical? Is it magic? Science fantasy? Is it magic? Is it deep technology? What am I reading about here? World building books. Memory is just one of my faves in that genre, and very much in kind of the cosmic powers tradition. If any of the readers like some of the stuff that they're reading, that's another book that I would kind of throw out there as being worth your while. Memory by Linda Nagata is a tremendous fun read in terms of that sense of wonder, science fantasy kind of feel.
There's actually a really interesting idea in the Linda Nagata story, which is that the civilization is ruled by this AI, and the AI has run all these simulations and concluded that too much peace and prosperity is bad for innovation and progress and stuff. And so there's a certain level of crime and terrorism that the AI basically like hires criminals and terrorists to keep society on its toes, kind of. So maybe that's an upside to not having too much peace and prosperity. All right. So I don't know, Becky, any final thoughts about any of the cosmic powers kind of stuff we've been talking about?
We've covered a whole lot of stuff here. Space is fun, and you should read this book. That's what I've got.
Yeah, I mean, if there's ever a time for escapism that's fun, now is it. So, like, grab this book and just disappear for a few hours. It's
I mean, that's the thing. People talk about escapism disparagingly.
No,
but escapism is so valuable. It's one of the most valuable tools we have. It's respite. It's a break from even when the news isn't terrible to look at. Just the everyday and getting to take your mind somewhere else to imagine things like, an AI who has to hire criminals or, what is it that makes us human? All of these questions I think are, I don't know, for me, at least they're what nourish me. And, I see a book of stories like this as nothing but a good thing.
I think Becky's so totally just dead on with that. I had a really tough childhood, and whenever I was a literature major and my professors would talk disparagingly about escapism sometime, I just had this immediate response of just, you don't understand. Like, I never, ever, ever would have made it through my childhood without just all that escapism that I had. That was my rock for my escape. The ability to escape just helped me just travel through every sort of sling and arrow that was thrown at me, because I knew that at any given point I could crack open a book and dip into the pages and just go to somewhere far away, somewhere different, and just experience a sense of wonder. And that just sort of, like you said, Becky used the word nourishment. That just basically nourished me through any sort of situation I was in.
All right, cool. So John, final thought.
Well, yeah, I just hope everyone goes out and checks out this book, and that if you do, you find some solace in it, some nourishment in it. If you want to learn more about it, just go to johnjosephadams.com/cosmic, and there's a couple sample stories you can read there, and you can read all about it and see where to buy it and stuff like that. But Yeah, I mean, I think if you enjoy this type of science fiction, just try to support it and try to talk about it online and tell your friends to make sure that people find out about it so that we can do more stuff like that. Because as everyone's been saying, it's like, hey, even if it's not something that's serious and seemingly directly related to the world at hand, there's lots of stuff to be found even in something escapist like this.
All right, cool. And so, and also Guardians of the Galaxy 2 comes out tomorrow, so I'll be there.
Or tonight at midnight.
All right, I'll be seeing it tomorrow, so.
Yeah, likewise. I've got my tickets for tomorrow.
Nice.
All right, cool. So, yeah, there's a lot to look forward to. We've got Cosmic Powers, we've got Guardians of the Galaxy 2, and so I think we're going to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with John Joseph Adams, Tobias Buckell, and Becky Chambers. So, guys, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, always good to be here.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to John Joseph Adams, Tobias Buckell, and Becky Chambers for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to Jens Blega, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. I'd also like to thank Nick Oakley and Jim Whitehead, who both just increased their pledge amounts. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.